If the iPad is dead, is its killer a MacBook? This is something I wanted to talk about for years, but since no one in my life cares about this Apple stuff, I decided to make a video about it instead. This video is also based on a blog post I did a couple days ago. The link will be in the description if you want to read the written version. There's this sentiment that started around the time the first M1 Macs came out. It's this idea that by moving Apple Silicon from the iPad and iPhone to the Mac, that those Apple Silicon Macs, specifically MacBooks, somehow killed the iPad, or at least made it redundant. You see this play out across the web in various articles and on social media, but you also see it here on YouTube as well. Pretty much every tech YouTuber that I watched has switched to MacBook Pro in the last couple years. It's actually one of the reasons I even started this channel. There's a lack of iPad perspective on YouTube that isn't, it should be running Mac OS or the iPad is dead. While I don't agree with this take on Apple Silicon and the iPad, it is an interesting topic to dive into. So let's go ahead and do just that. The Apple Silicon branding for Apple's custom designed chips started with the Mac, so most people associate that term to mean Mac SoCs. In reality, Apple Silicon as we know it today actually started with the iPad. The original iPad was the first computer Apple made that used one of their own custom designed chips.
iPad is powered by our own custom silicon. We have an incredible group that does custom silicon at Apple. We have a chip called A4, which is our most advanced chip we've ever done, that powers the iPad. It's got the processor, the graphics, the I/O, the memory controller, everything in this one chip.
The A4 chip would be downclocked and put in the iPhone 4 later that same year. From then on, every iPad and iPhone has used Apple's custom designed chips. They've continued to improve in both performance and efficiency, and the iPad Pro would even get its own enhanced version of these same chips, usually with an X suffix, like the A9X or the A10X. And those X chips have evolved into the base M series chips we see today. What did Apple Silicon really do for the Mac? It gave us three things: better performance, better battery life, and improved software compatibility. Some of this is illustrated by looking at these benchmarks between the 2020 Intel MacBook Air and the 2020 M1 MacBook Air. I chose these because for the first M1 MacBook Air, the chassis didn't change, so there's no skewing of the results because of better thermals like on the MacBook Pros. As you can see, CPU performance was much improved. Battery life was much improved, and the fan of course was removed in that M1 MacBook Air, so all without the additional benefit of a fan. It was really cool. Apple Silicon also added the ability to run iPadOS and iOS apps on the Mac. I talked about what Apple Silicon did bring to the Mac, but let's talk about what it didn't bring. When macOS 11 came out, a lot of people were convinced when Apple switches to ARM, we're getting a touchscreen MacBook. That's absolutely coming. And of course it hasn't come. Macs are keyboard and mouse only, whereas an iPad supports keyboard, pointer, and stylus all very fluidly. To a very vocal minority, listing iPadOS as a positive is crazy. Chances are if you're watching this video, you are probably not one of them. And this point isn't saying that iPadOS is better than macOS or vice versa. It's that if we go off of what Apple's been saying for years,
grafting touch on something that fundamentally was designed around a precise pointer really compromises the experience.
then bringing meaningful touch support to the Mac would mean having to do a pretty significant redesign, which if I had to guess would look a lot like iPadOS, which already exists on iPad. So to be honest, I haven't had a cellular iPad in years, but but I love that I have the option. You might be saying to yourself, well, I can just tether my phone, and that is true, but that comes with its own set of downsides, like heating up your phone and tearing through your battery. There's also another operating system issue here. So on iPad OS and iOS, we have low data mode, which can help control the amount of data that's being used by the operating system and applications. macOS, by nature of being more open, would struggle more with the low data mode. macOS and its applications were designed assuming a fixed, constant home or work internet connection. And because of that openness, there's nothing really stopping an application from ignoring something like a low data mode and just continuing to use all the data it wants, versus iPad OS, which Apple can at least make an attempt to regulate through the App Store. And yes, I know, App Store approval isn't perfect, they don't catch everything, but at least they try. When Steve Jobs announced the iPhone, he talked about the benefit of the software keyboard being that the keyboard shows up when you need it, and when you don't need it, it disappears. That's also true of the iPad, but it's true in both software and hardware. I can attach the Magic Keyboard whenever I need to do a lot of typing, like writing a blog post or script for one of these videos, but the 80 to 85% of the time I don't need it, I just attach it. People like to bring up that for the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, if you connect the Magic Keyboard, that it costs and weighs more than a MacBook Air. And while the cost is absolutely true, there's more nuance to the weight. Yes, with the Magic Keyboard attached, that iPad Pro does weigh 3 pounds. But again, that's only some of the time. When you don't need that keyboard, that same iPad Pro weighs 1.5 pounds, whereas that MacBook Air is always 2.7 pounds. At least for me. I haven't found a way to detach the keyboard yet, but if you have, please let me know in the comments. If you have an Apple Silicon Mac, you can install iPad OS and iOS apps from the App Store. Developers have the option to opt out of providing that support, and many do. A lot of the good apps don't end up supporting the Mac, whereas on iPad OS that's a little more difficult. If you're building an iPhone app, even if it's iPhone only, it's harder to exclude the iPad. You can at least run more iPhone apps than you can on the Mac. That experience ranges from terrible to almost passable if you're using Stage Manager. In the end, all that Apple Silicon really did for the Mac was give it better performance and battery life. And if you were a person who chose the iPad solely because it had better battery life than a Mac, then I guess Apple Silicon in the Mac does kill the iPad for you. But it's just such a weird argument. It never made sense to me because upgrading the chip doesn't give the Mac any of the other unique benefits the iPad has. If your reasoning is you just wanted to use a laptop, that's fine, but Apple Silicon didn't change that. That reason would have been true for Intel Macs as well. So leave a comment, let me know if I'm crazy, if you think I'm spot on, if I'm somewhere in between. I would love to get different takes on this. This is just the way I feel about it. As usual, if you made it to the end of the video, thank you so much. On your way out, if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel, that would really help out. And make sure to enable notifications so you get notified whenever I post new videos. And with that, I will see you in the next one.